So does the Mosaic Covenant matter? Yes, in the sense that we get a picture of God's standard. But it doesn't matter in the sense that it is not applicable to you today. This is why you're not sacrificing. This is why you don't have to worry about kosher laws. This is why you don't have to worry about, wars, like how do you do holy war and those standards. That's not applicable. But the standard of God's law continues on because the law is a reflection of his character. So here's a question you guys might wonder. Then why did God give the law and all these things? Well, let's go back to Galatians 3. I'm going to quickly show you Paul's argument in verse 17. This is what I mean. The law, which came 430 years afterwards, after what? The Abrahamic covenant, does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God so as to make the promise void. Here's Paul's point. God gave first an unconditional promise, right? And then 400 whatever years later, then he gave law. What does he say here? A law cannot get rid of the original promise. Here's an analogy I give. If I tell my boys, I promise you in 6 months, I'm going to take you to the zoo no matter what. Let's say 3 months later, they trash the house. I cannot say because you broke my commandments in the house, I'm no longer taking you to the zoo, because they will know that my condition of taking them to the zoo was based on what? Not my commandments, but based on a promise. So Paul's point is that because of this, God is going to keep doing, he's going to do all the things for Israel. Not because they're obeying the law, because the law came hundreds of years later and they kept breaking the law. It's because he originally made everything based on promise. When God elects his people throughout the Bible, he bases it on his promise. It has nothing to do with our behavior and the conditions of the law. That's his argument there. So let's keep reading. This is what I mean. The law, which came 430 years afterwards, does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God so as to make the promise void. Verse 18. For if the inheritance comes by the law, it no longer comes by promise, but God gave it to Abraham by a promise. In other words, think of an inheritance. What is an inheritance? It's a gift that the parents give to the children. It's not something that is earned. I cannot earn an inheritance in your family that is given to those who are rightly the heirs of those parents. Does that make sense? You cannot work for inheritance by definition. So he's saying, how did the Israelites, how are they the people of God? It is based on an inheritance or a promise. It's not based on the law. It's not this condition. The law wasn't given so that Israel would then become God's people. God was already chose Israel as his people. And by the way, God chooses us as his people based on grace and election, not commandments to a law, obeying commandment. So verse 19, why then the law? Here's the key. It was added because of transgressions until the offspring should come to whom the promise had been made. It was put in place through angels by an intermediary. What is the word transgression? Transgression implies a crossing of a boundary. The law is trying to tell you where the boundaries are. If God never told us the boundary, then there will never be a transgression. So here's what I mean. There was a time where you can drive. There's a time where people can hire kids to work in factories and jobs. You guys know that? There's no rights. But in 1938, a law was passed that said it was illegal to employ children in America. Why was that law given? It is to show everybody there is a boundary that you guys are crossing. We're going to make it official so that what? You stop crossing the boundary. If there's no speed limit on the George Bush Turnpike, you can go 95, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? So why do they post the speed limit? To show you are transgressing a standard by which we want to live by. You cannot speed. So why did God give the law? He's trying to show you there's a standard everybody keeps transgressing, but you don't know that it's a transgression until I tell you the boundaries first. The law was meant to condemn you. So let me show you this final chart though. Does this mean we ignore the law? Not quite. Because what we see is what is carried over is that the law is perfectly reflected in the new covenant. Here's what I mean. What was the greatest commandment in the law according to Jesus? The Shema, love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and mind, and the royal law, love your neighbor as yourself. That is what he repeats in the Gospels multiple times as the greatest commandment. Love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and mind, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus didn't make that out of thin air. It comes from the law. What are the 10 Commandments? The 10 Commandments, or the Decalogue, are the opening section of God's kingdom laws for Israel. Because remember, God was functioning as their king. Therefore, Israel was his kingdom. So here's the 10 Commandments that summarizes the standard and the conditions I have for my kingdom citizen. When did Jesus speak as a lawgiver in the New Testament? The Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 5 through 7. He gives that right after Matthew 4. He mentions that the kingdom of God is near them because he, the king, is there. And the opening section of the Sermon on the Mount is the Beatitudes. And the Beatitude is a summary of what it looks like to be in God's kingdom, which is a callback to the 10 Commandments. Now, the rest of the laws after the 10 Commandments is showing you how the greatest commandments are played out in case studies, right? Because what is all of the law? Love, right? Love God, love others. So here's the question for Israel. All right, God, how does it look to love my neighbor if their ox gored my slave, right? That's why they have a commandment on that. How does it look to love my wife when she's defied herself in some way? How does it look to love the foreigner in the land if they're not part of my tribe? That's why they had laws about the land. You leave some for them. How does it look to love widows and orphans? So there's all these case studies in the Old Testament law that was specific to Israel. Not for us, specific to them. However, when you look at the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes, the rest of the Gospels now is telling you the apostles' teachings. What are really the apostles' teachings? It can never mean for us what it never meant for them. What is the original context? Paul and all the other apostles are speaking on case studies in the church. How does it look to love my neighbor as myself when this person is sleeping with the stepmom? Or when this person says, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, and I'm of this? How does it look to love your Lord with all your heart, soul, and mind when there's a group of women taking over the church with paganism? What do we do there? Those are all what? The epistles are case studies. So what is the common theme for the Mosaic Covenant? We're not under the Mosaic Covenant. But the greatest commandment from the Mosaic Covenant continues. And the way it looks to follow God's righteousness in the church today looks very different than the Old Testament, but we're both following the same standard. So how does it look to love the Lord and love others for an Israelite back in Moses' time and afterwards? Look at the case studies. He tells you exactly in the Constitution. But how does it look now for those of us living thousands of years later, not as an Israelite? What does it look like to love God and others? Read the epistles. You'll see all the case studies there. God's standard from the Mosaic Covenant that is revealed has never changed. His standard has always been, my people in my kingdom love God and love others. So, does the Mosaic Covenant matter? Yes, in the sense that we get a picture of God's standard. But it doesn't matter in the sense that it is not applicable to you today. This is why you're not sacrificing. This is why you don't have to worry about kosher laws. This is why you don't have to worry about, wars, like how do you do holy war and those standards. That's not applicable. But the standard of God's law continues on because the law is a reflection of his character.